A very good evening to all our viewers today. Today we have with us a person who has worked in all the spectrums for the past 2 decades, from large companies and multinationals to NGOs and governments all over the world. He has also founded Innovation Forum and Sustainable Wine Roundtable in UK. Let us all welcome Mr. Tobias Webb.
Thank you. That's very
Hi.
kind. Delighted to be with you today.
A pleasure to have you on our show. So it has been you've had such an intriguing journey in the 2 decades that you've spent in corporate governance and ethics, and you've dedicated all your life to build responsible business leadership globally. What has been your motivation for the same?
Well, I think it's about trying to make a difference and do something positive. I never wanted to have one of those jobs where you just make money. I don't really see the point in just making money. It's nice to have a sense of purpose, really. So it's really about having a purpose-driven life and trying to make a difference where you can to help the world be a better place. And I try and do that through the lens of large companies and how they relate to the world around them.
That's very inspirational. So during your tenure as a chairperson of Ethical Corp, what were the ethical dilemmas you could cite that companies faced, and how did you resolve the same?
Well, I'm not sure we resolved many of the ethical dilemmas that companies faced. We certainly would shine a light on them and have a discussion about them. I mean, back in those days, from sort of 2001 to about 2014, it was a very different conversation until climate change became more mainstream. So, I mean, there were lots of ethical dilemmas around workers' rights, around things like, should companies invest in Burma, in Myanmar? That was a very big area. And of course, that has now come to the fore again, as we see what's happened there with the government. So many of the issues have been around for a long time. You know, what should the role of a large company operating in a country with weak governance be? And in many cases, what should the role of a large company in a country with stronger governance be? Because companies can be very powerful and they have to use their power wisely. So a lot of the ethical issues from 20 years ago are still relevant today. I think the difference today is that we have a lot more progress on the journey to fixing some of the problems. Things like living wage indexes, human rights guidance, environmental social governance criteria from banks and investors, you know, ESG. All of these tools and mechanisms and guidelines and pressures weren't really there in the same way 20 years ago. But of course, things like climate change rightfully have accelerated all of that. So now we see large companies facing lots of demands, not just from investors, but from stakeholders and employees and others, to be shown that they are making a difference in the work that they do to try and improve the lives of their employees, their supply chain, and their customers.
It's very interesting that you mentioned about ESG and sustainability. I'd also like to acknowledge, thank you, Dr. Michael Hopkins, for joining in the studio. So now that you mentioned about ESG and sustainability, how do you see that one can develop a sustainable business? What would be the key indicators, according to you, for the same, to ensure that so-and-so business is a sustainable business?
Well, I think it does just depend on the size of the company. I run two organizations. One has about 12 people, one has about 4. And for a small company, it's really all about purpose and about transparency and about treating people in the right way. And that's much easier to do in a small team. Larger companies have what behavioral economists have called diffusion. So if you pour 10 drops of orange juice into a liter of water, you have diffusion of that orange juice into the water, and that's what can happen with ethics. And so companies then need to work very hard to understand what their purpose is, what their ethics and values are, what their mission is, but they have to keep communicating that, and they have to keep remembering what they're there for. And that involves people and process, money, resource, training, etc. In a smaller company, that's all much more obvious. Once you have a sense of purpose, a lot of things flow from that. So it does depend on the size of organization you're in, and you have to adjust appropriately, I think. But certainly for a large company, there are lots of ways to learn about what you should be doing from other large companies. On the environment and human rights, there's lots of guidance and frameworks that you can use. The question is, if you're a large company, how much time and commitment and money are you prepared to put into that? And how are you turning it into a business opportunity? So yeah, it's a broad question, and I don't want to talk too much in broad terms, but I hope that's offered some kind of answer.
All right, thank you so much for the same. Now, as a former lecturer of Birkbeck College, University of London, and presently with King's College, what are the knowledge gaps that you observe, and which subjects do you think should be taught if you were to design a course?
Well, it depends on the kind of course. I think universities are catching up very quickly, and sustainability is coming into school education curriculums more and more now, and there have been some elements in the UK of going too far with that. I mean, there are environmental activists who go around telling 11-year-olds that they have no future because the world is ending because of climate change, and I don't think that's very helpful. So there are different influences on education, but certainly the last time I did some lecturing, which was a couple of years ago now, what with COVID and so on, I have been doing some online lecturing with the Stockholm School of Economics, and face-to-face as well here in Riga, where they have a campus. And I think the students really want to understand the role of business, as I previously mentioned. What is the purpose-driven business, and what do supply chain pressures mean for how companies should operate ethically today? And that's a real challenge. So it's really about incorporating the same things. If you're a large company, you can find the guidance on what you should be doing quite easily on the internet. And if you're a small company, it comes through purpose. So I would design a course that reflected that. And when I do lecturing, I tend to focus very much on real life examples rather than on theoretical models, because a lot of the academic literature has often been out of date by the time it's taught to students. And that's not necessarily the fault of academics. That can be due to the structure of academia, with peer review and peer review publishing, or publishing in peer reviewed journals and so on, which takes some time. I think academia is now catching up quite rapidly, and we are seeing some really interesting research projects. We have a number of students working with us through the Sustainable Wine Roundtable, for example, using their masters and some PhD studies to focus on sustainability in wine, and then we pay them to do work which they were going to do anyway, but we can also use for the members of the Sustainable Wine Roundtable. So that's a collaboration we have with Imperial College London, who are one of the world's leading universities. So we're seeing academia really start to catch up now, which is great.
Indeed, it is. Now, you have an exceptional work experience with a mixture of corporate and academia, as you rightly mentioned. The recent surge in ESG from investors is making companies change their sustainability approach. What are the top 5 difficulties you see that they may be facing, and how do you think that with research and development they could be addressed?
With regard to ESG specifically?
Yeah.
I think the problem with ESG and corporate sustainability is they seem to exist in two completely parallel universes half the time. If you read the FT's kind of Moral Money newsletter, which is a good bellwether on ESG, or you look at Bloomberg, which I do every day, the conversations in ESG are very different from the conversations in business, because investors haven't got time, haven't got the expertise, and frankly don't really care about what's going on in the supply chain, which is where all the action is on climate change and human rights, which are the most important issues. What investors seem to care about is ticking boxes and pretending to go green. And, you know, either we used to see negative screening, now we see limited engagement through passive investing, like BlackRock, for example. Lots of conversations about how BlackRock is the world's largest asset manager, is understanding sustainability. But when I work with large companies, nobody ever mentions them. So investment ESG is a driver for climate reporting, for compliance reporting on human rights due diligence, modern slavery due diligence, deforestation due diligence, general sustainability reporting, particularly on carbon and GHG through the Carbon Disclosure Project. And then there are other mechanisms as well, like TCFD and others. And the SEC in the UK is mandating more reporting. But ESG really acts in its own bubble to justify often limited change in how investment functions, but then it does act as a driver for change in companies. But it's not the biggest, to be honest. It's the ESG people massively overrate themselves in terms of their impact, and a lot of it is greenwashing. And if you really want to make a difference, you go work in the supply chain and try and work out what a just transition to tackling your scope 3 carbon emissions looks like. That's real work, not sitting at a computer applying a green ethical screen to some sort of fund. I mean, it can have some impact, but ESG people should be aware that they're mainly playing around the edges, while business and those who work with business are getting on with the real work. So I am a bit skeptical about it. I think it's very helpful as a driver, as an encourager. But as I have said before, and I'll stop repeating myself now, I think ESG massively overrates its own impact at the moment. And of course, one hopes that that will change very soon, particularly on things like climate finance.
Thank you so much, and we believe the same in what you're telling now. You are also the founder of Innovation Forum Publishing. What are some of the innovations that you may have integrated in a business to ensure sustainable development?
Well, there are lots of innovations happening. For example, understanding natural capital accounting is an innovation. Engaging with communities on the ground in agriculture or mining to give them a say in the work that's happening in their future is innovation. And I mean, I have a cliched saying that innovation is collaboration and vice versa. So then we have to say, well, what do we mean by collaboration? And there are some growing examples out there. Ending deforestation, for example, although deforestation is terrible in Brazil and in some cases even worse in Africa. In Indonesia, the rate of deforestation has slowed dramatically. Now, some people might argue that's because they ran out of trees to cut down, but that's not entirely true. It's also partly because of the collaborative nature of the approaches that companies have taken with NGOs, with scientists, with technology providers. So if a tree or an area of forest over a certain size is cut down illegally now, and it's within the sphere of influence of a company or in their supply chain, they can know about it pretty quickly and do something about it. So innovation is, as I mentioned, is collaboration, but increasing use of technology, both in agriculture, forest and land use, is really changing things. So for example, in agriculture, if you noticed a disease outbreak, fungal or pest-related, insect-related on a crop, the traditional thing to do would be to go and spray that whole field with a chemical to kill that pest or fungus. Well, if you use technology, and there are lots of different technologies out there, you can isolate the outbreak before it starts, and just take a very targeted intervention on a particular plant or row of crops, meaning that you don't have to spray an entire field. And that is a great example of innovation, because that saves farmers money, it saves the environment, it helps beneficial species exist, and prevents water supplies being polluted, chemical drift, and so on. So there are lots of examples of innovation out there. That's why we called our Business Innovation Forum, so that we could focus on human rights, modern slavery, agriculture, land use, deforestation, and plastics, but try and frame it, the solutions, as opportunities. Because you can't go around just saying negative things to people all the time. It becomes boring, and it encourages nihilism. And that's what some of the environmental activists are doing, who are telling 11-year-old children, like my niece, that they have no future because of climate change. That's a terrible message. We have to be optimistic, and we have to use innovation. And so those examples, I think, are good examples that we've seen. One other area that I'd cite in the materials area is use of cellulose-based waste. Now, we're all aware that plastic pollution is a huge problem, and it looks set to grow at the moment. But there's an awful lot of woody waste around. So what do we do with all that woody waste, all those leaves and stalks and plants and bits of trees that don't get used? Well, that could all be used to make energy, could be used to make fuel, could be used to make materials. And there's a lot of interesting innovations happening there, with companies working out what the materials and energy of the future might look like using natural innovation. So there's a couple of examples, I would hope, of innovation in action.
That's quite intriguing for all of us to know how these innovations could be integrated. Now, you're also the founder of Sustainable Wine. Would you like to share a little bit more on that? And could technology be used in order to bolster sustainable agriculture?
Well, yeah, as I just mentioned, wine, you can protect grapes from disease in multiple sprays using exactly the kind of technologies that I mentioned around targeted interventions and spotting disease outbreaks and volatile weather. So there's a lot that can be done with technology. And the Sustainable Wine Roundtable is a UK charity about to be incorporated, a non-profit which encompasses about 60 different wine businesses from and NGOs and academics, from Geisenheim University to WWF South Africa to representatives of Moet Hennessy, the largest wine group in the world. So we have 5-hectare farmers, we have huge champagne brands, and NGOs and academics all involved in creating what we're calling a global reference standard for sustainable wine, which is effectively the outline of the puzzle, which we need to then fill in with action research to drive sustainability in wine through joining up the various actors in the value chain, creating guidance, creating tools, best practice, etc. The ultimate aim, of course, is to talk more effectively to the wine consumer, but we're not there yet. There's a lot of work to do first on alignment and so on. So that's what the Sustainable Wine Roundtable is all about. And if you put sustainable wine into your podcast app, you'll find all of our events and podcasts for free on there. And we hope some of them might be useful for some of you if you're interested in that area. But wine's interesting because the vine is more studied than many other crops because of its high value. And so we think there's quite a lot to be learned in other crops from the experience of the wine industry, particularly on climate change adaptation, but also on other areas as well, not least around soil health. So it's a very interesting area. But of course, I know not everybody likes wine, but it is a fascinating industry.
That's very interesting to know so much about wines. On this note, I would like to welcome Dr. Michael Hopkins to share his set of questions. Dr. Hopkins?
Yeah, hi.
Yes,
As you
sir.
see, my telephone started to ring. The minute you ask a question, isn't it always the way? My other telephone. Hi, Toby. How you doing?
Good, nice. Good to see you, Michael. It's been a long time.
Yeah, it has been actually. Apparently, there was some epidemic called COVID around.
Yeah, apparently. Yeah,
My
yeah.
goodness. Yeah. Two comments I had on what you were saying. One is ESG. You basically talked about sustainability and the environmental aspects. Nothing wrong with that, of course. But me, I'm interested in multi-stakeholder approaches, so systems approaches, which would include all key stakeholders, which would include quite a lot of things in ESG and also more things as well. Governance, for example, is quite a big issue. So it strikes me that the sustainability movement has moved back into the environmental area. Nothing wrong with that, but it strikes me that you can apply the ideas of sustainability to all sorts of things, such as community involvement, boardrooms, operations, employee behavior, and so on. A multi-stakeholder approach. So I'm wondering why you don't do that. Maybe because you're doing so much already that you think to get into all those other areas would be rather difficult. And then my second comment on wine. I love wine, and it's quite interesting how the industry is changing. What's interesting, did you know that a lot of Burgundy is moving towards England because of climate change? Quite amazing. But if you walk around Burgundy, as I did last year, I don't think anybody was really talking about the issue of sustainability. In Burgundy, they're mainly small plots, 3 or 4 hectares, not very big, not the huge ones that you get in the Bordeaux area, where I imagine there's probably some issue there. But in France, the issue of durabilité, which could be translation for sustainability, one doesn't see too much of that. So I'd be interested in your observation, which countries have moved down the sustainability path. I suspect that Australia probably has. I can't think really of any other countries. So 2 issues: multi-stakeholder and sustainability, and where's the wine sustainability going? Thanks.
Oh, well, thanks, Michael. And yeah, as I said, nice to see you again. It's been some time.
Thanks.
I remember we did some the Liberal Club about 20 plus years ago together.
Yes, I think our age is showing.
I think that was in about 2001 or something. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, indeed.
So on multi-stakeholderism, I didn't mean to suggest that the companies that we work with do isn't multi-stakeholder. It is. I mentioned community involvement. I mentioned human rights. I mean, these are all, forests are best managed by Indigenous people where they exist. And so everything that we're doing with large companies is inclusive of stakeholders and has to be, otherwise they can't get anything done.
Sure.
I mean, for example, in deforestation, if you want to stop a forest being cut down, you don't focus on the environmental issues. You focus on the social issues. And it's social because trees don't cut down trees. People cut down trees.
Yeah.
I'll post something in the chat here, which is a piece I wrote after I went to Indonesia just before COVID. And I wrote a sort of case study of how forest protection and restoration actually works on the ground. And it's all about focusing on people. And to do that, you need local help. You need NGOs, you need community leaders. I suppose the stakeholder I mentioned that's not as active as I think they could be is the investor community. And they are active as a driver, as I mentioned, of sustainability reporting. but and they are getting more active in financing solutions, but nowhere near on the scale that they should be, frankly. Private equity is doing more in many cases to fund startups with solutions than big banks. And part of the problem, as a senior banker told me recently, was since they screwed up so badly in the financial crisis, the compliance regime on banks has been so onerous that they, all they want to do is try and tick the boxes and not get fined. Look, I'm no expert on finance, but I just want to emphasize that the companies we work with are very much cognizant of the need for stakeholder engagement, and they do that. And the investor community is a part of it. I just don't think they're doing enough. And I think they're a bit self-satisfied, and they think that doing what they're doing is perhaps good enough. And they're curiously absent from much of what we do in a strategic way or in an implementation way. Now, what I mean by that is the big names in ESG, not the targeted financiers who are doing some fantastic work. I mean, there's people like Lestari Capital, Rabobank, many others that do an enormous amount. The State Bank of India, as I recall, does a huge amount of lending to agriculture, and that's kind of partly what they're there for. And so I didn't mean to tar all finance with the same brush. I just meant that when you look at the conversation about ESG, it is very different from where companies are trying to focus. And I wish the investors understood supply chain issues better, I suppose, is the one point I'm trying to make in an overly convoluted way. On the wine side of things, who gets it most? I think those on the front lines are getting it most. I think all the major wine producing regions get it. I've been interviewing grape growers about sustainability for about 15 years for the site we run and the blog I used to write. Climate volatility has been an increasing factor for all of them. The question is, what do you do about it? And so in France, there are some very serious drivers for more work to be done. You have a thing called HVE, Haute Valeur Environnementale, 1, 2, and 3, which if you want to be a Cru Bourgeois producer in Bordeaux, you have to get to HVE2 and then soon to HVE3 certification, I think by 2025. I need to check the details of that. In Burgundy, they have been devastated last year by hail at the wrong time of year. And in fact, a lot of France just had bad hail just last week and the week before in June. And that's catastrophic for grapes. So climate volatility is something they're all aware of. The question is, if you're a 4-hectare producer, what do you do about it? And last year in the snap frost they had, which I think was in April, just when bud break happened, some of the producers were hiring helicopters to fly above their vineyards to move the air around to try and stop the early stage grapes from freezing. Now, that's not a very sustainable climate change solution to have a helicopter above a 4 hectares of grapes. And what they also do out in Burgundy and elsewhere is they put oil drums out in the vineyards and just burn them all night to try and raise the ambient temperature to stop the grapes freezing. That's not very sustainable. There are increasingly better ways to do this, and that's what we're trying to uncover at the Sustainable Wine Roundtable. If New Zealand has some innovation on tackling climate change adaptation, well, why can't they share that with Burgundy? And why can't Burgundy share it with Napa Valley? Why can't human rights lessons from South Africa be applied to the wine industry in Chile? No one is joining those dots, although there are now, at the last count, 39 different certification schemes and standards in wine. No one is joining all the dots globally, and nobody's including the distribution chain or the sellers of wine. And that's what we're trying to do. It's a tough journey. We spent an entire year just getting alignment amongst the members, and sometimes you feel like you're not getting any work done. Getting everyone on the same page. So there is action there, Michael. It's a good question. It's not, again, with ESG, I'd say action's happening. It's just not fast enough. And we're not looking in quite the right ways that we should be. But
I suspect that one reason that the message is not getting around is language. especially to France. I mean, they're not very polyglot, and so not so interested in those issues. Oh, by the way, in my little house up in the Alps, because of global warming, I've started planting vines. I'll let you know how that comes along.
Yes.
But
Yeah, well.
I just wanted to mention one thing from the Financial Times this morning. You probably didn't read it, but on companies and democracy, one of the big issues of the day. And as you may know, my last book about a month ago talked about corporate responsibility, sustainability, and the big issues of the day. I was looking outside the usual stakeholder framework. And so I was looking at, what are the big issues that companies would be tackling, and how would they do it, and how would they make any money out of it? So it was quite interesting to see that the Financial Times, and as you mentioned, their work on moral capitalism is pretty good. And this article this morning, if you haven't seen it, on democracy, I thought was very good. Yeah. So, a big issue, and companies, should they get into it? Are they getting into it? Why and wherefore? So I think what's kind of interesting in the 20 years that we've been in this business is that it really has expanded into every nook and cranny of business. And I normally encapsulate it in terms of short-term versus long-term interventions. Most companies, of course, look at the short-term for survival and the rest of it. It's only the bigger companies, generally, sometimes small companies, who are looking at the longer term and looking at the more, shall we say, esoteric issues such as ESG. Anyway, good to hear you, Toby, and keep well.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Yeah, same to you.
Thanks very much.
Keep up the good work. We can't have too many books, frankly. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Would there be any final message to our viewers who are watching it right now, or may watch the recorded sessions?
You mean a concluding message? Sorry, the connection's not very good. Let me just switch to.
Would there be a message to all our viewers who are watching? Am I audible?
Hi. Sorry, could you say what you said before? I missed it.
Yeah, would there be any message to all our viewers who are watching the show right now, or who would watch the recorded session?
Well, I would say the best place to spend your career as a professional is working in sustainability. But I would advise you not to get caught up in some sort of box ticking, questionnaire filling exercise, and focus on change and where you can make change happen. And I think agriculture and land use and materials, things that can make a real difference to people in the environment, that's where the interesting work is. And I would say, if you want to learn more about sustainable wine, go to sustainablewine.co.uk. And if you want to learn more about innovation in corporate sustainability, have a look at innovationforum.co.uk. Both are very global, and I think there's a lot there that we are sharing that could be helpful. I mean, I don't even have time to look at everything we publish because there's so much of it, and it's increasingly getting very detailed and very solutions orientated. So I'd encourage everyone to lean into that and to join the journey towards improved sustainability while we still have a planet left. But I am optimistic that we can tackle the challenges. I think we underestimate the Earth's resilience. We underestimate our own ability once we recognize a crisis. So I'm optimistic about the future, and I think you have to be, and we have to use innovation to get us there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was very profound. Thank you.
My pleasure. Happy to join you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Hopkins.